the oversized, ridiculously dense slab of basalt, intended to be the world's first industrial-grade cleaver, skittered across the wet savanna floor like a hockey puck thrown by an angry deity. The basalt behemoth was shaped less like a tool and more like the catastrophic debris field of a small asteroid collision. It lacked any discernible edge. Its only function appeared to be resisting all attempts at portability. Thag, a specimen of Homo habilis who hadn't quite mastered bipedal running in high wind, was locked in a panicked, one-sided tug-of-war with his own creation. He gripped the slippery, 9-foot-long stone with a desperate, white...
Oh, you have got to be kidding me!
He shrieked, his voice thin against the rising gale. And here we are. This is Thag, a creature perched on the very precipice of intelligent life, currently demonstrating the cognitive ceiling of a damp sponge, trying to manage a piece of heavy patio furniture in a Category 5 hurricane. Thag's attempts to secure it resulted in a frantic ballet of accidental self-mutilation. Every 2 steps forward involved 1 step back, one embarrassing skid, and an audible, wet slap of his shin against the rock. The wind itself seemed personally affronted by his lack of grace, howling derisively as it used the rock's immense surface area to turn Thag into a reluctant, caveman-era windsock. This truly was the pinnacle of 3 million years of evolution, a creature fundamentally annoyed by gravity and friction. This moment of existential terror, juxtaposed with the utterly pathetic struggle of trying to keep hold of an unwieldy rock, was the inevitable result of 2 things: a colossal dead Paleoloxodon, an ancestor of the modern elephant, only somehow more colossal and judgmental in death and, as always, the big ego of one male determined to impress a female. Rewind 2 agonizing hours. The target of Thag's ill-conceived affection was Xena, the clan's expert flint napper. Xena's blades were precision instruments, swift, silent, and efficient, capable of dismantling large fauna with surgical elegance. Thag, however, wanted to be a disruptor. He proposed the axe of awkward power, a massive, unsharpened chunk of basalt designed purely for brute force impact, rendering Xena's subtle skill obsolete. Thag's axe of awkward power, by contrast, looked like a child's crude drawing of a hammer. It was cumbersome, jagged, and philosophically opposed to being sharp. His rationale, whispered with a predatory gleam, only understood by insecure males across all eons.
Bigger is better.
He envisioned it as a time saver, allowing him to bludgeon through meat and bone simultaneously, ignoring the fact that it required 3 men just to lift it. When Xena demonstrated how her thumbnail-sized tool could sever a tendon, Thag merely grunted and pointed at his basalt monument.
At mine,
he insisted, his voice cracking with the strain of intellectual vanity.
Has just mine. Has gravity working for it.
That's like a whole extra factor. He truly believed he had cracked some fundamental code of physics. Instead of just creating a geological liability, Xena had merely arched an eyebrow, confirming that Thag's self-regard was, scientifically speaking, larger than his entire tribe's collected water supply. This, of course, was the catalyst. As they began the monumental task of hauling the useless callback, the axe of awkward power, the sky turned the color of week-old bruise, triggering the great storm. The storm was not a gentle shower. It was the climate throwing a tantrum. It was a biblical deluge of warm, thick water, turning the fine, dusty earth into a chocolate-colored river of kinetic sludge. Visibility dropped to approximately 0, which was arguably a mercy, considering the surroundings. The first drop of rain was the starting pistol for prehistoric Murphy's Law. Not only did the downpour instantly transform the ground into the world's slickest slip and slide, but the massive, half-processed elephant carcass, which they had foolishly tried to shelter beneath, began to groan. The noise of the rain was quickly superseded by the sound of the elephant carcass itself, which began to emit a variety of unsettling noises. This was a low, geological sound, followed by a wet, bubbling shudder, the sound of gaseous buildup finally finding an exit point, signaling that the dead creature was about to become an active danger. The air, already thick with the scent of wet earth and bad decisions, suddenly acquired a sharp, intensely unpleasant ammonia note. It was the smell of ancient death, spiced with regret. The storm didn't just arrive, it ambushed them. The first disaster was a classic domino effect. Krog, Thag's perpetually aggrieved assistant, was attempting to secure a pile of newly acquired meat vital calories they couldn't afford to lose by using the awkward axe as a makeshift anchor when a sudden gust of wind, strong enough to rip a tent from its modern-day pegs, hit the axe. The entire 9-foot slab of basalt catapulted into the air. The basalt missile, now an agent of chaos. He saw the impossible happening. His entire protein supply was being dragged away by the most inept anchoring device in history. He didn't scream about the existential threat or the loss of their meal. Instead, as he was lifted bodily by the subsequent shockwave, he shouted a protest that perfectly encapsulated the mundane misery of their lives.
Not the face!
He yelled, instinctively diving not to save the meat, but to protect the one part of him that wasn't already bruised.
But I just washed this loincloth! I demand a refund on this evolution crap!
His trajectory was a magnificent, soaring arc of pure slapstick physics, culminating in a wet impact near a cluster of terrified proto-ostriches. The axe slammed into the partially dried hide of the deceased Paleoloxodon, causing a ripple across the massive, decomposing mound. This elephant was a truly hideous animal, possessing a specific oddity, a single, asymmetrical tusk that curled inward and made it look permanently disappointed. Even in death, gray mass, the carcass slid, then began its catastrophic tilt. We are witnessing the birth of the concept of unforeseen consequences, and it weighs about 20 tons. The massive pendulous ear and evolutionary cooling fan, now acting as a giant aerodynamic scoop, caught the full force of the gale. The carcass flipped, sending a shower of mud, partially digested grass, and Krog, who was hiding behind a rib cage, yeeting across the clearing like a fleshy, bewildered cannonball. Thag, witnessing this high-speed, structural failure of his temporary shelter, stood frozen, freeze frame. He was momentarily paralyzed by the sheer, unbridled incompetence of the entire situation. He stared at the sheer, overwhelming volume of deceased pachyderm currently tilting towards him. It was at this moment Thag knew he messed up. The narrator pauses, allowing the inevitability to sink in. We all know what happens next. The shadow of the falling giant enveloped him. He managed a single, choked whisper, prioritizing vanity over survival.
Not the face!
The world became a deafening crash, a thunderous, squishy sound of meat and saturated earth. The money shot, when the dust, mud, and panic finally settled. Thag was gone. Xena and Krog hesitantly approached the debris, expecting nothing more than a new, very flat member of the tribe. They found Thag wedged between two massive forelegs, completely unscathed. Why? Because the axe of awkward power, the 9-foot, unsharpened, ridiculously oversized, useless hunk of basalt had been driven by the wind and the falling carcass to land vertically, point first, right under the elephant's belly, acting as a ridiculously effective, perfectly placed jack. It had elevated the crushing weight just enough to spare Thag, creating a perfect, if incredibly smelly, air pocket. Accidental success. He emerged, blinking, covered in rancid elephant fluid, but alive. He looked around at the chaos. The meat secured by nothing more than gravity and luck. The giant tool wedged perfectly beneath the mountain of flesh. Well, Thag declared, dusting off a handful of viscera with a look of supreme confidence.
So big.
Plan achieved.
Yeah.
Tool worked. The understatement of the epic.
Yeah.
Thag, now smelling like a dumpster fire at a fish market, preened openly. Xena, dog finally stumbled back, soaking wet, shivering, and immediately complaining about the structural integrity of his primitive footwear. This is not covered in my job description, he muttered, shaking his fist at the indifferent sky. Xena simply stared at him, then at the useless axe, then back at the man who had nearly been turned into primordial soup, and sighed the first sigh of weary exasperation that would define all subsequent human relationships. And so, humanity lived to see another day. Not because of intelligence or superior planning, but because one man's gigantic, misplaced ego was perfectly counterbalanced by a piece of geological garbage. The real lesson learned? Absolutely nothing. They spent the next 6 hours using Xena's tiny, effective blades to chop meat, confirming that the biggest evolutionary hurdle we ever faced wasn't saber-toothed cats or climate change. It was dealing with Thag. And here, 3 million years later, we're still dealing with him.